What are transgender rights in America today? It's February 2022, and Americans are divided. Let's first dive deeper into the issue.
This year alone, more than 100 bills targeting the transgender community have been introduced in over 30 states. That includes laws restricting transgender participation in sports, passed in 7 states this year and 1 last year.
I can tell you this, in Florida, girls are going to play girls' sports and boys are going to play boys' sports.
Lawmakers who support the sports bans argue transgender girls have an unfair advantage. Mental health advocates worry the wave of legislation is marginalizing a community that already faces higher rates of depression and anxiety. A recent survey found more than half of transgender and non-binary youth have seriously considered attempting suicide in the past year.
Let me be clear, the passing of these bills will harm trans lives.
Violence is a concern, too. So far in 2021, at least 28 transgender or gender nonconforming people have been murdered. Most are Black or Latinx. At this pace, it will be a record year.
Every time I walk out of the door, I'm afraid if I could make it back alive.
My guest today is Alex Petrovnia, a binary transgender man. He's the founder of the Transformations Project, a nonprofit dedicated to tracking and educating about transgender legislation in the United States today. In this episode, we discuss if transgender athletes have an unfair advantage, if there's only 2 genders, controversy from Dave Chappelle's comedy special, age limits for transitioning, and more. Whether you agree or disagree with today's guest, I invite you to join us with an open mind as we work to heal the division on today's transgender rights. Alex, thank you so much for joining me tonight. Can you start with an introduction, who you are, and why you decided to join the podcast today?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me, first of all. I am Alex Petrovnia. I am a content creator on Twitter primarily, where I talk about trans issues and specifically try to educate cis people on how they can stand up for trans rights better. I'm also the founder and president of the Transformations Project, which is a small nonprofit that seeks to educate about the legislative crisis going on currently in the United States for trans issues. And so what we're trying to do is both create a database that is accurate to what is going on right now and raise awareness for people to contact their representatives and actually make a change about these issues.
You mentioned a legislative crisis. Can you expand on that and why you see it as a crisis?
Oh, absolutely. So more anti-trans bills were filed in the year 2021 than were filed in literally all years in American history leading up to that combined. Our biggest state was Texas, which had over 40 different bills introduced, and several of them have been reintroduced for this new legislative session. And we are kind of looking down the barrel of another year that promises to be very similar.
What's something that you wish more people understood about the transgender community today?
I suppose that's a very broad question. So I suppose the main thing is that trans people aren't coming after you. They're not trying to invade your spaces. They're not trying to create discord or chaos, or they're not trying to trans your children. We are literally just trying to live our lives in peace and be left alone. So I think that's the first broadest point that you need to start at to have any kind of empathy going forward. There's a lot of fear mongering about trans people, and I think that reflects much more cis people's insecurities than it does the reality of trans existence.
And to provide some context for our listeners, what was your experience deciding to make the transition?
For me, I am a little bit atypic in that I knew I was trans from when I was probably about 13 or 14, but unfortunately I was unable to transition due to safety concerns and just because the environment I was in was not conducive to that. But I kept just trying to put it out of my mind and kept trying to say like, oh, I can't do this. I can't transition. I can't deal with this. I can't be one of those people hearing all the negativity about trans people for 10 years. And to be honest, trying to stay closeted, and that nearly killed me multiple times. Luckily, and with some help, I made it through. And finally, I got to the point where very early in the pandemic, I was thinking about it again and trying to talk myself out of it, just like I always had. And the pandemic hit, and I was stuck with just myself and my own thoughts. It got to the point where I was like, fuck it, the world is ending. If the world is ending, I'm going to be happy. And so I took the leap. And it really is that when you start transitioning, because there's no test for whether it will help or not, or whether it will make your life better or not. But I guess the best advice I can give is if you're seriously considering transitioning, you probably are going to benefit from it. Most people who are not trans don't seriously consider transitioning.
And for those who were opposed to your decision, what's primarily the type of feedback that they provide as to why?
So I have a pretty wide internet presence and I get a lot of negativity from that. Most people tend to think that it's actually very misogynistic how they come about it. People tend to think that I'm just this poor, confused woman who hates herself and hates her womanhood. When actually, ironically about this, before I came out and before I started transitioning socially, I really thought that being a woman and womanhood in general was just experiencing misogyny and nothing else. I thought it was just this horrifying suffering experience that people had to endure. And it turns out I thought that because I wasn't a woman. Once you understand that, my appreciation for femininity and womanhood and that I can see other people genuinely enjoying that has increased dramatically. So it's kind of ironic that the number one criticism that I get is almost backwards.
What is something that you think the media misreports or misconstrues regarding the transgender community?
They try to portray trans people as these invaders or as trying to create more trans people or trying to take over or trying to alter your way of life, when really we are genuinely just trying to live our own lives in peace. And the things that the trans community needs that we try to advocate for are primarily we need the ability to make our own legal decisions and we need the ability to make our own medical decisions with our doctors. It really comes down to an issue of privacy and an issue of autonomy. It comes down to bodily autonomy and saying, hey, I want to be able to make my own choices and make my own decisions for myself as a responsible, full adult. And the people who want to deny that are the same people who want to deny other autonomy in other regions. And so that's why you see a lot of issues where trans rights overlaps with things like women's rights and abortion rights and healthcare issues, because it is really all about autonomy and the ability to self-determine yourself.
So with that, our first news clip.
Controversy is brewing as Thomas smashes records, some in the sport questioning whether she has an unfair advantage. Following NCAA guidelines after a year of hormone replacement therapy, Thomas was granted the chance to swim on the women's team. After 2.5 years of such therapy, last month, she recorded the fastest times in college swimming in the 200 and 500-yard freestyle and won the 1650 freestyle, beating her nearest competitor by 38 seconds. The editor-in-chief of Swimming World magazine, John Lone, writing an op-ed last month, saying Thomas's competition in championships could create, quote, an indisputably unfair setting. Lone noting that Thomas could approach champion Katie Ledecky's freestyle record. University of Pennsylvania leadership says it's heard criticism from students and parents, several of whom reportedly sent a letter to the NCAA demanding changes to the rules. The NCAA did not respond to NBC News' request for comment.
Do transgender athletes have an unfair advantage in sports?
No, there's a couple reasons why not, and I'd like to approach a couple of them, if that's all right with you.
Sure.
So the number one thing is that every single human being has a wide range of different attributes, right? Each individual has a wide range of things like muscle composition or height or fast twitch muscles or even hormone composition. Those are naturally arrayed along the spectrum. And so if you're trying to say someone has an unfair advantage simply because of a sex category they were assigned, why is it not an unfair advantage when other attributes are different? Why is it not an unfair advantage when people are taller or when people are, naturally stronger? Those are traits we celebrate in athletes. Yet when someone is transgender, that becomes scrutinized and criticized immediately. The other thing is that the few accurate studies that have been shown, I've read the papers, and the papers pretty clearly show that after a year of hormone replacement therapy, muscle mass composition in trans women is not significantly higher than in cis women. And it comes down to, how do you want to police the system? And the interesting thing about Leah Thomas, and the interesting thing about that clip that you just showed me, is it highlighted all of her wins, right? It didn't highlight any of her losses because it was a biased media piece. She recently lost to 4 different people, one of whom ironically was a trans man who hasn't started testosterone yet. So by the NCAA standards, he is supposed to be competing with the women, right? And it really comes down to a media bias and how these issues are being portrayed. If you come and you say all of these big scary numbers and you say, oh, she has an unfair advantage, that is clearly what that media piece was trying to convey. And it comes to the point where, one, it's just not that simple, where everybody has a wide range of traits. And 2, the science tells us that hormones are powerful things. Hormones are very powerful things. Hormones control things in your body that you had no idea they even did. And I say that as somebody who has undergone hormone replacement therapy, and my life changed. I punched a hole in my ceiling by accident recently after I started testosterone because I was trying to mop my floor and the mop got stuck in the bucket. I tried to wrench it out and I had no idea of my own strength because I just started testosterone, and I punched a hole in my freaking ceiling. And all of that is basically a way to say they really try to paint trans people as this emergent threat, and particularly trans women as this emergent threat. Everybody has different advantages and disadvantages naturally. So why is it different when they're transgender?
So you mentioned that a year later, there was almost no difference. So do you feel that there should be some sort of waiting period for a trans athlete before they can compete?
Well, currently the waiting period on the NCAA is a year.
And do you think that should continue?
My personal opinions on athletics is that I think participation should be valued more than competition. And so in my personal things, I think people should be able to compete and self-select where they would like to compete. So no, I don't think there should be a waiting period, but I see the reason for it. And I'm not particularly into competitive sports myself, so I am not the extreme expert on that, but I do know the science and I do know the background of it. The 1-year waiting period is based on the best evidence we have right now if your goal is to create as fair a playing field as possible. Yes.
And do you think, while we're discussing swimming in this clip, that there should be differences depending on the sport? So, for example, if you're involved in mixed martial arts.
By that question, you're getting at, are certain athletes a threat to other athletes? And I don't believe so. I believe that genuinely in a sport, there should be safety standards set. There should be, protective equipment when necessary. There should be rules to mitigate harm. You mentioned mixed martial arts, which is probably one of the sports that has the least protections built into it. It comes down to how we societally view women and men and gender. We perceive men as aggressive and as a threat, and then we perceive trans women as aggressive and as a threat. But that doesn't actually reflect the reality of the situation. It reflects our own internal biases. There are women out there who are much stronger than many men out there. There are women out there who are much taller than any men out there. These ranges of traits cover wide ranges, exactly as they say. And it just comes down to the point where if you only care about these discrepancies when someone is trans, does that have more to do with you actually worrying about how tall an athlete is or how strong an athlete is? Or does that have to do with you worrying that the athlete is trans? Because that is the differentiating factor. We don't worry when an athlete is super tall and very, very strong. We celebrate that. And the difference comes down to transphobia.
Well, with that, I want to move to our second news clip.
Comedian Dave Chappelle once again at the center of a swirling controversy.
Oh, buddy, I'm in trouble now.
The polarizing stand-up drawing swift backlash for jokes in his latest special, The Closer.
Gender is a fact. This is a fact. Every human being in this room, every human being on earth had to pass through the legs of a woman to be on Earth.
Critics characterizing the remarks as transphobic and slamming Netflix for airing them.
TERF is an acronym. Stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminists. This is a real thing. This is a group of women that hate transgender. They don't hate transgender women, but they look at trans women the way we blacks might look at blackface. I'm Team TERF. I agree, man. Gender is a fact.
Is gender a fact?
So gender is a fact, but not in the way Chappelle means it. What Chappelle is saying is that he truly believes that gender is binary, meaning that there are only men and women, and that gender is fixed, meaning that it is constant throughout the lifespan in an individual. There are only two options, and that you are sorted into one option by your genitalia, which, given the full range of human experience and the complexity of the human mind and the amazing things that humans create, is just a shallow way to look at it, frankly. No, I do not agree with Chappelle. I agree that gender is a fact. I agree that every person has a sense of their own gender. The way he says that so confidently is just kind of funny to me, because it's something he's clearly given a couple hours of thought to and hasn't delved below the surface at all and given much thought to.
Are there a fixed amount of genders then?
That question comes up a lot, and that question is often used as a trick question, because then you'll get someone will answer and then you'll get a headline that says, oh, there's, someone believes in 1 million genders. What I believe is that every individual person has a different perception of their own gender, and that can only be determined by the individual. So by that stand, I believe there are as many genders as there are people, just because every single person is individual. There's not a limit. That doesn't mean I'm trying to list every one of these millions of genders. It doesn't mean that I'm saying that people have to select out of like some gigantic list. No, you just are who you are.
Do you think it is appropriate to be asked what your gender is, whether it's for paperwork or for any type of classification reason?
Sure. I think that there should be broader options in a lot of cases. I'm seeing a lot of people adding non-binary options to those questions, which is really great. What I do see that is a problem is a lot of people conflating gender with your sex. So they'll say, what is your gender? And the options will be male or female. And neither of those is a gender. Those are sex classifications. And so people get caught down in the details and they get confused a lot. So I don't necessarily think that asking someone's gender is incorrect or wrong. I think we base way too many metrics specifically on the binary system currently. And I think the more we lock ourselves into that, the more we're going to see results that only fit that. If you only ask about men and women, you're only going to get responses from men and women.
Do you think it's okay to mock or make comedy regarding the transgender community? And if so, where do you think the line gets crossed to where it's inappropriate?
I absolutely believe it's possible to make. His comedy wasn't the problem. There's a difference between making jokes at the expense of a community and making jokes that are respectful of that community. In his special, he repeatedly misgenders and dead names a trans woman who he believes and he claims was his friend, even though there are many evidences that that was probably not the case. And she unfortunately died due to suicide. And it is implied that friends like Chappelle were likely involved in her quality of life degrading to the point that she felt she had to take her own life. And so that is where a lot of the offense comes from. Someone died and he's laughing at her after her death. And this is a thing that I tried to communicate to my audience when this was going down, is one of the worst fears I can have is that I'll be misgendered after I die. Because imagine that not only you are dead, but you are actively being erased afterwards. And people are talking about this fictionalized version of you that does not exist. It's dehumanizing. It's not funny. The other thing is he was making fun of the TERFs issue. They are a group of people. They are not just women. There are many men TERFs. Believe me, they hate me especially. who believe that transgender people should not have the same rights as others and generally are pitted against the transgender community at many opportunities. They pit themselves against the transgender community. And so making fun of this community that has caused tangible harm and playing them as light and saying, oh, I agree with them. These are people that literally assemble themselves in mobs to try to tell trans people to commit suicide online. That is planned. There's a website that they use to plan things like this. These aren't a moderate group of people, and they aren't people who are playful. It's a serious issue. People are dying and people are hurting, and it's not funny.
So you mentioned at the expense of versus being respectful. Is there a way that you can draw the line there? Because I feel like then it becomes everyone's definition of when it's at the expense of the trans community, and then that's where it becomes a slippery slope.
I think it comes down again to autonomy. If you are respecting the autonomy of trans people and respecting our self-decisions while making your comedy, then go right ahead. There are trans comedians, there are trans comedy specials. I would recommend some, they're pretty great. There's a lot of comedy to be had about functionally redoing puberty as a 20-year-old. Don't get me wrong, there's plenty of material. But it doesn't have to be material that actively supports people who are causing material harms. I guess that's where I draw my line. Is there material harm being done to people, and are you openly espousing that? And that is where Chappelle was.
Well, with that, we'll move to our third and final news clip.
The Tavistock and Portman NHS Trust told us the experience of regret described here is extremely rare. Their gender identity service for children in Leeds and London now has a record number of referrals. The clinics here and in London see 3,000% more patients than they did 10 years ago. Among girls, referrals are up more than 5,000%. There's no question this service is helping children who feel distressed in their own bodies. But the full impact of children making decisions about their gender at such young ages may not truly be clear until much later in their lives. At 21, it's had a positive outcome for Jamie and his mum. After testosterone and surgical treatment, he's far happier than the torment of his teenage years.
It was kind of hell. Like, it's just not something you'd want to go through if you were trans. Like me, it's just, it's awful. Like, everything that happens to you within that stage of puberty for a female, for a trans man, it's awful.
There's currently no data for how many in the trans community detransition, and to talk about it can be viewed as transphobic. But people like Ruby say more discussion is needed.
In your opinion, is discussing this transphobic?
Absolutely not. Discussing detransition and detransitioners is absolutely not transphobic. They absolutely exist and they should be supported. And I genuinely think they should be supported by the trans community as well, because they have a lot in common with the trans community, particularly in the ways that they're stigmatized against. I think they should be supported in their detransition if they choose it. A couple of things in that news clip were actively incorrect, though. We do have good data on how many people choose to detransition. The data shows that about 1 to up to 3% of people choose to detransition. But the data also shows that when in a supportive environment, that number reduces to less than 1%. A lot of people who detransition do so because of pressure in their family and in their environment to not be trans anymore. And that has much more to do with transphobia than it has to do with treatment. And so we want to be able to support people to, again, make autonomous choices and make their own choices. And so for people who undergo transition and then realize that it genuinely did not help them and who want to detransition, we absolutely should support them in their autonomy. Regret rates after transition are laughably rare, genuinely. So the regret rate for general surgery, so for if you take all surgeries together, all surgeries of anyone, and you say, hey, did you regret getting that surgery? For all elective surgeries. So elective surgery doesn't necessarily mean it's a choice. It just means it's not an emergency. So this includes things like cancer. This includes amputations. This includes a million other things. The regret rate for surgery is about 15%. About 15% of people say, hey, I wish I hadn't got that surgery. The regret rate for transgender related surgeries is less than 1%. Yet they're the ones that are being more and more tightly regulated. And you have to ask yourself, does that mean that we're basing these decisions in reality, or are we basing these decisions on transphobia? And it comes down to, we're basing these decisions on transphobia, unfortunately.
How would you distinguish what this supportive community should consist of? Because I feel like there's a balance in, say, in this example, a parent wanting to do what's best for their child and making sure that before they commit to a decision that they fully think through the implications, but also having the fear of coming across as transphobic in doing so.
Sure. And that is a difficult balance to strike. Absolutely. In general, if somebody wants the best for you and is willing to listen to what you have to say, that will do wonders. The other thing that a lot of people don't consider, and that comes up a lot, is that most trans people know they're trans long before they come out or say anything. Because most people don't say anything to people in their lives because of transphobia until they are really damn sure. Because it is a huge deal and it is life-altering and potentially life-ruining for many, many people. By the time somebody comes to the point where they're telling you, I am trans, they have given it so much more thought than you can even imagine. And by the time they come to you and they say, hey, I want to pursue this option, they have given it so much more thought. And that's just something that people need to keep in mind, particularly, because it's very, very frustrating when it's something that you've been obsessing over for years. And finally, you're like, oh, I see some hope. I see the light at the end of the tunnel. This could make my life better. I'm miserable right now. And the response of people in your life is to say, but are you sure? Believe people when they say they're sure.
Now, if someone thinks they're sure, should there still be age limits attached to that decision?
That question in and of itself is too broad. Gender transition is a huge category of things. Gender transition means everything from getting a haircut and going by a different name, to buying new clothes, to getting surgery, to hormone therapy. So you mean medical transition. And medical transition itself is a whole range of categories as well. The current system is set up that nobody's giving people under the age of 18 surgeries. It's just not happening in the US or the UK. Nobody's giving people under the age of around 15 or 16 hormones. What they are giving is puberty blockers, which are reversible and have over 40 years of proven safe usage history. If you decide that you don't want to transition, you can go off of puberty blockers and then you will undergo a normal puberty just a little bit later. And you will be perfectly the same as you would have been. And so I do think that there are some limits to allowing children to make those decisions. And puberty blockers are a really elegant and brilliant solution to that, where we can say, hey, the harmful effects of an incorrect puberty could cause you all kinds of distress and harm. So let's prevent those. But at the same time, let's wait until you're a little older and reach the age of medical consent before we start you on HRT. And that's the way the system is done. And genuinely, I think it's a good system right now, if people have access to the system as described.
Now, Alex, for my final question, you're specializing in tracking legislation related to transgender rights. So I do want to ask you, do you feel that this issue of rights for the transgender community has been politicized along party lines? And if so, in what way?
Oh, absolutely politicized over party lines. In general, Republicans want to enact laws to prevent transgender children from accessing care, from participating in sports teams, from changing their names, from all kinds of different things. Those are some of the big ones. In general, Democrats are somewhat neutral about the issue because transphobia is really, really everywhere. There are some Democrats who are outspoken in support of trans rights, and we appreciate them. But in truth, the reason this is such a crisis is because the Republican Party has taken this as a crusade, and the Democratic Party has just kind of blown it off and kind of said, oh, that affects a tiny percentage of people. What does it matter? Not to say that that tiny percentage of people is very vulnerable and desperately needs help.
Well, Alex, is there a final message or thought that you'd like to share with listeners?
Yeah, I think I'd like to give a little bit of a plug, and I'd say if you are interested in helping to support transgender rights, visit transformationsproject.org, just all one word, and you can track legislation in your state and figure out who you can contact to help protect vulnerable transgender youth around you.
And that'll be shared in the episode description as well. Well, Alex, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and honesty today.
All right. Thank you so much, Kevin.
Whether you agree or disagree with today's guests, I thank you for joining us with an open mind. If there's a guest or topic you'd like to have on the show, you can message me on all social media platforms through the handle Heal Our Division. Take care and stay kind. We have more in common than that which divides us.